Remarks for the differential diagnosis among some personality types. 1 and 3. Though alike in regard to self-control and formality, they differ in that E1 is restrained and serious, while E3 is expansive and cheerful. Also, E1 is more tradition-directed, E3 other-directed. 1 and 5. Though both are controlled and perfectionistic, they differ in that they identify more with the dignified or the guilty subself, respectively, and E1 is assertive and straightforward, while E5 is shy and inhibited in expression. 1 and 6. The predominantly dutiful variety of E6 may be difficult to discriminate from E1. One difference lies in the greater assertiveness of the latter. Another, the greater difficulty of the fearful in coming to decisions. Also, E1 is more active. 2 and 3. Though both share the concern for personal appearance and the thirst for attention, E2 is comparatively free and spontaneous, while E3 controlled, fearful of letting go. Also, E2 tends to be invasive, E3 more mindful of limits. 2 and 7. Though both are seductive and hedonistic, E2 is a truly emotional type, while in E7, a warm amiability exists in the context of a greater independence and in a background of cool non-involvement. 2 and 8. Though the proud can be impulsive, arrogant, and disdainful, E2 is definitely emotional, while E8 is active. E2 is predominantly seductive, E8 more oriented to power and explicit dominance. 2 and 9. While sometimes I have seen E9 and E2 confused in view of their generous disposition, no character could be called less histrionic and less egocentric than E9, while E2 is minimally resigned or routine-oriented, and E9 is consciously disinterested, while E2 is manipulative and self-centered in his giving. Also, E9 is patient, E2 impatient. E9 matter-of-fact, E2 romantic. 3 and 4. As in the case of the distinction between 2 and 3, that of 3 and 4 involves the contrast between over-control and emotional expressiveness. If the stereotype of E3 is a Barbie doll, that of E4 is a ballerina. Most distinctively, there is the contrast between the E3 elated disposition and a greater contact with sadness in E4, which echoes good and bad feelings about themselves, respectively. Though both can display an interference with spontaneity, this takes in E3 the form of formality, and in E4 that of affectation. Also, comparatively speaking, E3 is more intellectual, and E4 more emotional. 3 and 5. These are difficult to confuse, since E3 is efficient, and 5, in its otherworldliness, inefficient and impractical. Both can be called narcissistic in that sometimes E5, just as E3, seeks being and love through performance, but their style is different in that the E3 is more social and confrontive than the schizoid, while the latter avoids confrontation and social contact. 3 and 4. No. 3 and 6. These may be difficult to distinguish in some instances, since E6 can display much vanity and E3 may be prone to anxiety. The content of this anxiety is usually different, however, more in connection to self-disclosure and separation in E3, more in relation to making mistakes or not knowing what course of action to follow in E6. Even though E3 can be highly intellectual, his intellectual orientation is that of needing rational support for practical action, whereas E6 generally is more interested in theoretical and metaphysical issues, beyond the practical. Perhaps more striking than the introversion-extroversion contrast between the types is the inner directedness of E6 vis-a-vis the other directedness of E3. 3 and 7. These may be confused in that E7 usually regard themselves vain and extroverted. Frequently, the motivation to achieve is stronger in E3, while in E7 it is tempered by a self-indulgent aversion to effort. Also, while E3 may regard him or herself as an enjoyer, E7 is more exactly a hedonist in that the desire for pleasure exists in the context of true permissiveness and little concern for social conventions. More decisive still is the contrast between them in terms of discipline versus control, and that of permissiveness versus control vis-a-vis others. 3 and 8. These can occasionally be confused in that the E3 individual may be aware of having developed self-assertive competitiveness in a vindictive manner, and may be both dominant as well as competitive. The main difference, as in the distinction between 3 and 7, is the impulsiveness and rebelliousness of E8, in contrast to the typical self-control and conformity of E3. 3 and 9. While the contrast between these may be striking in terms of perceived achievement motive, both can be workaholics and both live on the surface of their being. Also, E9 can be as unemotional as E3 seems to be, and E3 as affectionate as E9 typically is. One difference between them is that E9 is the most tradition-directed of characters, while E3 is the most other-directed. Also, E9 character exists in the context of visceratonia, while E3 is that of the somatotonic background. While both are practical, the former is relaxed and the latter energetic and direct, not only in physical, but psychological posture. 4 and 5. E4 and E5, sharing the bottom of the Enneagram, share the underdog identification that implies feelings of inferiority and guilt, as well as a submissive tendency. While E4 hangs on to relationships in face of frustration, however, E5 gives up, and while the depression typical of E4 is, in line with its emotional background, one of grief, weeping, and self-accusation, the depression of E5 is a dryness and hollowness, a forlornness in which grief seems to have been buried under a layer of resignation. On the whole, we may say that E4 is intense, E5 the least intense of personalities after E9. 4 and 6. Perhaps the most striking difference between these types is the emotionality and expressiveness of E4, in contrast with the intellectual centeredness and inhibition of E6. They are not easy to confuse. 4 and 7. The contrast here between depression and elation, and also between guilt and the feeling of being okay. E4 also has more of a superego characteristic than E7. In most cases, E4 expresses more anger than E7, who is compulsively gentle. 4 and 8. Though these types have much in common, there is a more emotional intensity in the former, and an intensity of the active life in the latter. Also, anger in the former lasts longer, while in E8 it is dissipated through its explosive expression. More important yet is the contrast between the impulsiveness of 8, that goes after what it wants, and the inhibition of E4, whose strong desiring goes hand in hand with self-prohibition and an inward condemnation of over-desiring. As a consequence, E8 invades, E4 complains or manipulates through suffering. 4 and 9. One feature in common between these characters is that they can constitute the background for depressive states. Even in these cases, however, E4 goes together with a claiming type of depression, while in E9 there is a depression of pure grief and passivity, in which we do not sense the dramatic element and the attention need of the former. Though both have received the label masochistic, E4 is emotional and hypersensitive, E9 practical and long-suffering, E4 histrionic, and E9 phlegmatic. 5 and 6. May be confused in virtue of the schizoid features of E5, as well as the sad moods of the more avoidant subtype. Also, E5 can be, as E6, distrustful, yet the distrust is more avoidant than even in the avoidant or phobic E6, who is more dependent, more affectionate, and generous, both in terms of availability and in the quality of being good hosts. Also, E6 is comparatively more disciplined and takes external authority more into account, both in terms of submissiveness to conventional or actual authority, and dominance towards those lower in the authority hierarchy. 5 and 9. It is possible to confuse these characters, for, in spite of the contrast between the hypersensitive introvert and the undersensitive extrovert, in both we may speak of resignation and self-forgetting. The difference is that between a resignation away from people, isolation, and a resignation with participation, contactfulness, which implies the contrast between a non-generous and an abnegated characteristic, respectively. Most characteristic, however, is the contrast between generosity of E9 and the limited availability, cooperation, and support volunteered by E5. 6 and 7. E7 is more likely to be charming than E6 and considerably more adaptable. The experience of anger, on the other hand, is more prominent in E6. Most striking is the difference in regard to guilt as characteristic in the latter by its presence, as it is in the former by its absence. Whereas E6 has a hierarchical view of relations, E7 approaches people as equals and is little intimidated by authority. While E7 is, in a broad sense of the word, a fear type, he is not prompt to anxiety as E6, and fear is only a psychodynamic aspect behind compulsive gentleness. 6 and 8. The distinction here is quite clear in terms of unassertiveness versus over-assertiveness, and manifest fear versus manifest fearlessness. Except in the case of one of the subtypes of cowardliness, the counterphobic character, which in the pursuit of strength and pugnacity may simulate the phallic narcissistic character. One difference between them is the greater intellectual orientation of E6, which contrasts with the anti-intellectual orientation that is more frequent in E8, and also the greater presence of guilt and concern for intellectual authority, as well as a measure of introversion of the former, and the greater impulsiveness and indiscipline of the latter. 6 and 9. One difference here is that of the introversive-extroversive characteristic. Another, related to the above, the predominance of an intellectual and sensory-motor orientation, respectively. While E6 orients itself to hierarchy, E9 rejects a hierarchical perspective. Also, while E6, together with E5, is the most inner-directed, E9 is the most pure expression of tradition-directedness. 7 and 8. The difference between these two characters may be conveyed in terms of the contrast between tender-mindedness and tough-mindedness. Though both are impulsive, the former is intellectual, the latter active. Also, while E7 tends to be submissive, E8 is dominant. 7 and 9. These may be confused because the passive and lazy characteristics, sometimes present in E7, are interpreted as an expression of the E9 ruling passion. One difference is that the intense fantasy life of E7 contrasts with the lack of interiority of E9. Another, the foxy astuteness and subtlety of E7, which contrasts to the lack of subtlety and the naivete of the Sancho Panza syndrome. Furthermore, the self-indulgence of E7 contrasts markedly with the capacity of E9 to postpone his desires and to over-adjust to the milieu. Furthermore, while gluttony leads to psychological complexification, however, psychological laziness leads to oversimplification.